Fantastic. So now we are going to another non-traditional security issue that affects all of us in our daily life, cybersecurity. I'm sure all of us have at one point or another received one of those emails where a company you shop with online has some kind of breach, and now your credit card has been compromised and you have to go change one of your billion passwords. But we've also seen that these cyber attacks and cyber crimes can happen on a massive scale with really serious implications for our militaries, our societies, and our economies. So in our next session, we will have the opportunity to hear a little bit of storytelling from the deputy head of NATO's cyber unit, Chelsey, who's going to help paint a picture about how these cyber threats happen and what they mean in real life. And after she's finished, we will have a quick opportunity for a Q&A. So please be thinking ahead. And with that, please join me in welcoming to the stage Chelsey. Fantastic. Chelsey, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Today, our cyber story begins and ends in Ukraine via Copenhagen. When the worldwide container tracking logistics operation at Maersk was knocked offline, do you remember what happened 5 years ago? You might have seen the Wired magazine story about it, the most devastating cyber attack in history. Just in case you didn't see it, here's what happened. On a sunny afternoon in June 2017, Maersk's tracking logistics operation was wiped out. In the words of one IT staffer, I saw a wave of screens turning black, black, black. A computer worm made its way from one small software company in Kyiv, Ukraine, to machines across the world. Some of those machines belong to Maersk. Based in Copenhagen, Maersk is the world's largest container shipping firm. According to one statistic, Maersk's ships carry up to 20,000 containers, and they arrive in a port somewhere around the world every 15 minutes. In all, this represents approximately 1/5 of the entire world's shipping capacity. Not to mention the global disruption to the delivery of all sorts of goods, making their way across the oceans to us. But it wasn't only Maersk that was affected. While originally targeting entities in Ukraine, the malicious code spread across the world, affecting everything from our mail to our medicine. FedEx, TNT Express, Merck, Mondelez, even a Cadbury chocolate factory in Tasmania was affected. Long before the pandemic, when the word viral took on a completely new meaning, the NotPetya cyber incident really did go viral. It was global in reach, and it cut across sectors. The total damage of the NotPetya cyber incident is estimated to be about $10 billion globally. And in the words of Andy Greenberg, the author of the Wired magazine story on NotPetya, distance is no defense. Fast forward 5 years later, back to the streets of Kyiv. A brutal, wholly unprovoked, and unjustified invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The war is happening in the physical world, but it's also taking place in the digital world. Cyberspace was used to open the invasion, to disable Ukrainian communications, and the ability for the government to communicate with its people. Attacks with data-wiping malware targeted Ukrainian entities in government, commercial, and energy sectors to paralyze computer systems. Ukrainians attempting to check in with loved ones to see whether they were safe from harm were denied access to the internet by cyber attackers. But some of these effects were not just limited to Ukraine. Thousands of miles above the Earth, a satellite called KA-SAT provides high-speed internet to people across Europe. Just before the invasion on the 24th of February, the satellite connections were interrupted. Tens of thousands of people were knocked offline across Europe, from the Czech Republic to the UK, from Poland to Germany. More than 5,800 wind turbines across Central Europe lost connectivity. Many of them were disrupted for weeks. These cascading effects are significant, and they're serious, and they could have easily been worse. Cyber attacks can affect our ability to turn off the lights or to access our digital lives. At worst, they can even threaten lives. They can have physical effects, such as disrupting the transportation of people trying to flee violence. They can have cognitive effects by creating chaos, confusion, and uncertainty in those that are vulnerable. Cyberspace is also a place where not just governments are actors. Looking at the war in Ukraine, the role of non-state actors is striking. From Elon Musk delivering Starlink internet, to social media companies restricting access to Russian media state outlets, or to businesses withdrawing their support and their services in country. Not to mention global hacking collectives unleashing so-called cyber war on both sides. It was reported that Ukraine's IT army has more than 300,000 members on its Telegram channel. You wouldn't imagine that an army of citizens could suddenly take to fighter jets or to warships to support their country's war effort. But in cyberspace, the dynamics are different. The barriers for entry are lower. Actors can buy malicious software on the web and pose a considerable threat. So Lauren, why does all this matter? From the NotPetya cyber incident 5 years ago, to the cyber attacks we're seeing today in Ukraine and beyond. Cyberspace is on at all times. It's a contested space. We are constantly connected. We have countless devices. The impact of technology on our lives is real. It underpins practically everything that we do. So while today's cyber story might begin, and it might end in Ukraine, it can have impacts across the world. These impacts can take us offline, disable our ability to communicate, disrupt energy flows, and distort the way we understand the world. So this makes it a matter of concern for us all, from Ukraine to Copenhagen, to Tasmania, to right here in Belgium.
Thank you so much, Chelsey. And you're right, cyber is something that just doesn't discriminate and have an effect on everyone at the same time, and it can spread so quickly and so easily. So thank you for highlighting that and painting a picture. We have just about 1 minute before we'll transition to our cyber simulation, which I'm really excited about. But I think one of the questions all of us are thinking, based on what you outlined, is what is NATO doing to help bolster its defenses and to counter some of these cyber attacks and these challenges that you just highlighted?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Lauren. I think you can think of the activities that NATO and allies have been taking recent weeks, months, even years, as we recognize the evolving threat that cyberspace poses. You can really consider it along 3 main lines of effort. So the first is we see there's a lot going on in cyberspace. And so how do we make sense of this so that we can then inform our leaders to take decisions. So the first thing that NATO's been focused on with its allies is really trying to connect the dots, ramping up information sharing, using NATO as a platform where everyone brings their pieces of the puzzle so that you have a better idea of what's happening, so you have a better idea of how to advise on what responses could be. So the first really is around information exchange, using NATO as that platform for overall situational awareness. The second piece, which is linked to it, is if we have an idea of what's happening, how then do we prepare and guard against it? And here, you've heard also through the discussion today around critical infrastructure. So how do we help allies using NATO as a platform once again to enhance their resilience to guard against some of these threats? And you've seen several allies in recent days releasing advisories, warning publics, warning critical infrastructure operators of some of the risks that we're seeing. And last but not least, cyberspace is a shared space. And so NATO and its allies are working very closely, not just among the 30 allies, but also with partners. And we're providing practical support to Ukraine. Several allies have offered even more assistance, looking at really how to support in defending against these cyber attacks, but also working with the private sector, recognizing that we're all part of this collective of enhancing our resilience and security in cyberspace. So those are the main areas around trying to understand what's happening, guarding against some of the risks, particularly to our economies and our societies, and then working with others who all have different pieces of the puzzle to put that together and be more resilient in the process.
Resilience, such a key word we hear so much about these days. So thank you so much for that. We're going to stick with this set of issues on cybersecurity and now move, while we stay on stage here, we'll take part in a quick cyber simulation, which is something I've been really looking forward to. So I'll ask everyone again to go into the app because we are going to respond to a series of questions that are going to be led by our terrific CEPA Senior Fellow, Jason Israel. He's going to walk you through a scenario where all of you will have to demonstrate your skills in responding to a cyber attack. Let's see if we're better at this than geolocating. First, to see what challenge we have to tackle, let's go to Danica from Sky News Australia, who will give us a scenario before Jason picks us up virtually.
I'm Danica DiGiorgio, and we're, of course, back to this major developing story of suspected simultaneous cyber attacks on shipping ports in Europe and the United States. While many details are still unclear, here's what we know. Earlier today, Europe's two largest shipping ports in Rotterdam, Netherlands, and Antwerp in Belgium reported within minutes of one another suffering technical problems that forced operations to a halt. Shortly after, across the Atlantic, the Port of New York and New Jersey, one of America's largest, was forced to shut down due to similar issues. The severity of these problems, along with the simultaneous occurrence, have had over the past several hours many experts speculating this was likely the result of a cyber attack. Rotterdam and Antwerp together process over 100 container ships each day with 2 million tonnes of cargo, and in the Port of New York and New Jersey, an estimated $200 billion in goods move through each year. All are heavily relied upon for US and Europe's imports and exports. This just in, we are now receiving reports that electrical power grid fluctuations have been reported in southeastern Europe, and two transmission system operators, ESO in Bulgaria and Transelectrica in Romania, have activated emergency system defence to attempt to restore electrical power to its normal state. These effects are in sections of Europe's continental Europe Cyclodius area, the largest in the world, serving 35 countries and over 400 million people. We can now report that both European and American authorities have confirmed suspicions that these ports and electrical grids were targets of an unprecedented cyber attack, with the attackers at this point a mystery. The many uncertainties surrounding these extraordinary developments have sent global markets reeling, while all European stock markets currently remain open. Declines in New York, London, Frankfurt and others illustrate the global nature of the situation. We are told that the European leaders and the US President have been in communication. Also, that the NATO leadership and the NATO Military Committee will convene shortly to discuss security implications of these developments. We will continue to monitor the impact of this astonishing news. Simultaneous cyber attacks on US and European ports and the European electrical grid, with volatility in the markets currently open as we await more information and official statements from Washington, Brussels and throughout Europe. More to follow after a short break.
Hello, everyone in Brussels. I'm Jason Israel. Thank you, Chelsey, and thank you, Lauren, for that perfect introduction to what we just saw, the situation that Danica just reported on of these unprecedented cyber attacks. I would like to invite you to take yourself from Brussels, where you are there in the studio room, or wherever you're watching remotely, and take you to Washington, D.C., to the White House Situation Room, or to Brussels, to the NATO Military Committee, to The Hague, to Albany, New York, to Trenton, New Jersey, to Sofia, Bulgaria, to Bucharest, Romania, where during this situation, all global leaders are poised and fixed their attention on what's happening with these unprecedented cyber attacks. Now, you are those leaders. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions that are going to help guide us a discussion about how the world can respond to an attack like this. First of all, the question I have for you is to define the severity of this situation from the perspective of national security. Would you view this as an armed conflict, a security breach on critical infrastructure security, or is this a private sector business risk issue? I'd like to give you a little bit of time to look at that. Okay, so now taking a look at these results, as I go through each one of these, the reason that these questions are so difficult and these factors are not necessarily easy to define is because many of the laws and policies related to armed conflict and related to security have been built for the physical world over the last decades and centuries. So when it comes to cyber, these are not as easy. So of course, you look at the unprecedented coordinated nature of these attacks, and it definitely looks like whoever is perpetrating these attacks has done it to affect a national level attack. And to that point, it looks like armed conflict. However, for these other two options, security breach on critical infrastructure and private sector business, we just have to remind ourselves that many of these targets are private sector entities. So whereas a military base being hit by something may relatively be easily defined as a armed forces target, it becomes much more difficult to define from both a domestic legal and an international legal sense when we think about the severity of the attack. Okay, good job. Let's keep moving along. Now we have to figure out how we're going to react to this. Of the following options, what would you view as the best immediate response? Would you immediately follow all of the standard technical procedures to bring services back online that companies like ESO in Bulgaria and Transelectrica in Romania have put into place? And would you convene the international institutions and governments to decide on response first? Or finally, we've developed computer emergency response teams throughout these nations and throughout the alliance. Would you inform them and rapidly deploy these computer emergency response teams, or what we call CERTs? I'll give you a little time to go through that. Okay. Now, the big point on this question is, Danica, in her introduction to this, had breaking news that it is confirmed that this has been a cyber attack. That particular point is one of the most difficult during this whole process. We have private sector companies often reporting that it can be days, weeks, sometimes even months after a cyber attack where they found out that they've been attacked, because they wouldn't necessarily see the effect like this. And so part of it is an investigation to whether you even have a cyber attack. So in this scenario, as we've said, companies like ESO and Transelectrica have moved automatically into their system defense mode. That would be their local technical procedures, partially because they didn't understand it was a cyber attack at first. They were going through their normal procedures. Now, the next two, convening international institutions and governments and deploying computer emergency response teams, these would come when you start to know a little bit more about what is happening, what could be the cause of the attack. And remember, we don't even necessarily know who did the attack yet. But when we're actually trying to decide what the national or international response should be, we're going to have to want to figure that out. And to do that, we're going to be collecting information and intelligence on what we know when it comes to who conducted the attack. And having all of that information resident in each one of the countries across the alliance, as well as at NATO headquarters, brings up another question. As we move forward and we start to get more information and we start to get more intelligence we're sharing across, team, what is the appropriate media and public communications policy as we get more information? For a cyber attack of this scale, would you recommend we be proactive and provide all information to the public with continuous updates? Should we be more passive and respond to questions only and include only fully confirmed information? Or should we block and deny reported information or refuse to comment because of the implications of sharing that information? I'll give you another little bit of time.
This one's pretty split.
Yeah. Okay. Now look, team, the reason that I'm giving you these questions and these particular solutions are they're not easy. And of course, always it depends, right? So I'm bringing these questions up because if you think about the movement of information about how these attacks took place, who might be responsible, comes into one other, major hurdle, which is how can information be shared across the alliance, across the Atlantic, and between different institutions, and at what speed? So picture one individual nation finding out what they believe is confirmed information about who the attacks were. And I'll just broadly categorize attackers. That could be a state actor, like another country that's actually trying to do this, or it could be a private group that's conducting cyber terrorism, or there could be something in between where there's a state that rather than using their own personnel to conduct the attack, they're sponsoring another group in order to do it. So it makes it much more complex. And if you think about it, when we think about conflicts at any time right now in Ukraine, when we're looking at these horrific numbers and these horrific reports of warfare within Ukraine and the human toll, we kind of understand it because we've been raised listening to history and understanding what the toll of physical warfare is. But if we're educating the public real time during this situation where the shipping of the world is affected, the markets are reeling because of it, electrical grids are fluctuating and power is going out, there's also a key sense of education that has to happen when we're proactive. And to be a government leader, to be a public sector or private sector leader, providing that assurance that across the alliance we are doing everything we can to address it. But at the same time, if we're sharing information, we're sharing intelligence publicly, that could actually aid the adversary because we are reporting what it is that we know. And if the adversary, the attacker, can see what it is that we know, then they might be able to more effectively continue their attack. So it's very difficult in this scenario to also determine how you move forward when it comes to your public media stance. So we've heard from Chelsey. We've heard from Lauren and Chelsey discussing NATO's preparation. We've gone through this scenario a bit together, and we've gone through 3 questions that we as leaders in international institutions and government leaders have to face as we go through a scenario like this. So lastly, before I provide some closing thoughts on this and we move ahead, I would like to just hear from you in an open few words, seeing this, and as we prepare and move forward, knowing what you know now, having seen this scenario, what do you think needs to be our first priority in improving cybersecurity? You can list one word or a few words. That's a good one.
Guys, we're the digital generation. We can't go analog.
I do like the thought, Lauren.
It's a valiant effort.
Sometimes, right? Yes, I'm just going to give this a few more seconds, but I'm really enjoying seeing your responses formulate here. Thank you. So yes, so that's why we're here. We're here in a forum where without this actual scenario taking place for real, we can educate on what does it feel like to actually
Recording in progress.
To see this report.
Recording stopped.
To see this, what is it like to see this scenario? What does it feel like? Just taking that moment to picture a day where that news clip actually comes up for real, and thinking through all that you've done and being able to look back on this session and think, what is it that I started to prepare myself for? How did I educate myself? How did we cooperate internationally to move forward a little bit better when it comes to this? And so just a couple of key points on that as we move forward. One is cyber is thought of by a lot of people to be something that computer scientists or programmers are the ones that get into. And I want to tell you that throughout my journey working with what is now US Cyber Command, over the last 15 years since we've worked to build the US Cyber Command, we need people that are thinking about policy, people that are thinking about marketing, people that are thinking about language translation, people that are thinking about history, philosophy almost, trying to understand where does cyber fit into this world as a public good versus being a risk as well. So no matter what field you're in, cyber affects you, and not just because you're an internet user. It can be something that you get more both educated in, proactive in, and then ultimately can enact more leadership in, which is, as you can see from this scenario, something that we definitely all need. And finally, my point, and then I'd love to turn it over to Chelsey for a couple minutes, please, after your wonderful introduction, to just see if you have any closing thoughts from the NATO perspective on any of this discussion, is just to say that the physical world, again, for decades and centuries, our history books and our understanding about what a missile impact means and what escalation means when it comes to firing back with a missile is generally understood in the field of warfare. But I think that in the field of cyber warfare, we're still writing the foreword to the book, maybe even chapter 1 of the book, when it comes to our understanding of how to respond to a cyber attack and how to move forward in a situation like this. So I'll begin to close my remarks now based on everything that we've gone through. Just in review, what is the severity of the situation? Armed conflict, or are we going around trying to make arrests? Is it a legal issue? Is it a critical infrastructure issue? Or are we relying on the private sector to be able to handle it itself? When it comes to responses, are you following local processes? What does it mean to convene for a cyber security and cyber attack incident and across governments and across international institutions? When it comes to your media posture, do you share everything? Can you even share anything if it's classified or if it's intelligence? And then what are the education and, of course, public confidence elements of that? And finally, your wonderful words that you used for improving cybersecurity, primarily in education and international cooperation and others. Chelsey, we've just been through an amazing cyber attack, and I'm really impressed by this team. and how they've come to in just a few minutes understand the realm of responsibility when it comes to responding to a cyber attack. I would love to hear your thoughts from your perspective before we move on.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that one of the words that appeared up there was international cooperation, because obviously working for an alliance of 30 countries founded on the idea that we can achieve more when we work together, that's absolutely critical. And as we saw from this scenario too, often it's not just governments or the state that are owning or operating critical infrastructure, for example. So then, as the scenario showed, working then with the private sector, working with those that actually have that expertise to operate and own this infrastructure is absolutely critical. So I think it goes back to what we discussed at the very beginning, this idea around trying to connect the dots and have as much information as possible. It's very challenging at the beginning, especially because you're trying to understand what's happening, so you can then advise on what responses are appropriate. Next, who's taking the lead? Who needs to be involved? What are the different roles? Do you remain at a national level or even a local level if it starts there, a national level? And then how does that international cooperation piece fit in? I think in addition to the notion of international cooperation, once again, this highlights the importance of resilience and the importance of being prepared to deal with the range of cyber threats, which is something here we're working very closely to do. And last but not least, it was mentioned in some of the earlier sessions, but would really encourage everybody, whether you like in this field to work for the private sector or the public sector, a national administration or an international organization, including this one, really it's a field that needs the experts, the ideas, and so would really encourage you to consider it. Thanks, Lauren.
Super. And maybe, Jason, if you'll allow me just to jump in here, because we have about 1 minute left before we wrap up this segment, but there's some really interesting questions coming in the app here, and I wanted to take advantage of having you both here because there's a question about, does NATO have offensive cyber capabilities? We've talked a lot about resilience and trying to defend against cyber attacks and mitigate risks, but what do you make of offense? How does that work?
No, that's a great question, Lauren. NATO is a defensive alliance. Allies have been very clear about that notion. NATO, as such, relies, like in the other domains, air, land, and sea, on the capabilities and the assets of its allies. Cyberspace is no different, and so allies have agreed to volunteer the range of their capabilities for the benefit of NATO missions and operations, as you said, Lauren, to make sure that we're defending in this space, but that we're also able to carry out the core tasks, including collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. So the bottom line is, like in the other domains, NATO relies on allies for the range of capabilities, and it is for allies to then offer the effects of those capabilities to ensure that NATO can carry out its core tasks.
That's great. And Jason, in 30 seconds, could you give us a perspective from a U.S. Cyber Command? How is the U.S. thinking about cyber offense?
Yes, well, absolutely. And Chelsey nailed it. It is exactly right, is that we work with each one of our partners to determine what is an offensive cyber capability. But if you haven't learned this in the last 20 minutes, in cyber, it's always just a little bit more difficult. Why? Because what is even constituted offensive can actually be different in cyber in one example area, which is, we think of computer network of defense. You have a big wall that you're using. What if you set it up such that if something hits it, it automatically hits back at something that's been attacked? That's a response action. And the big question, and it's a policy question across different countries, is that an offensive attack or is it defensive, your network just being able to plug something? So just that additional question is something that we can continue to educate ourselves. So if that day comes where it's hopefully not, that a cyber attack happens like this, then we can all be reading off the same legal and policy definitions as an alliance.
Jason, thank you so much. All right, shall we check in with Danica and see how we did?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks all.
I'm Danica DiGiorgio reporting on this rapidly developing story of multiple coordinated cyber attacks in the US and Europe. As we await formal comments from US, European and NATO leadership, we can reflect on the unprecedented nature of these incidents. The level of coordination and the widespread effects on trade, electricity and markets suggest today marks a new era that many have predicted, but that we all hoped would not come to be, where cyber warfare is employed on a massive scale with little regard to the devastation in its wake. We can all hope that today's leaders, and importantly, the emerging leaders of tomorrow, are preparing to stay a step ahead of the attacks such as those we see in the US and Europe today. We'll be back with more as this story unfolds.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chelsey, for joining us. Many thanks to Jason for that scenario, and thank you all for your responses. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay.